I had come to the conclusion that her views on the topic were rather strongly opposed to those of St. Thomas, and in my view, of Aristotle. I had even gotten some confirmation of that verdict from a piece by Anthony Kenny. So I was just going to sort of lay out and assess the opposition that I thought I saw. But really now it seems to me that Anscombe's views, in a way at least, are considerably more in harmony with Thomas's than I had thought. And there I think I got some confirmation of that from Professor Mueller's paper yesterday. So my title is a bit blander. But my basic concern is just about the same. Because I think that there is a real opposition between Aquinas and certain authors who do present themselves as followers of Anscombe, or at least as inspired by her on this topic, and who have taken the position that I had attributed to her, and if anything, made the contrast with Aquinas even sharper. I mainly have two authors in mind. I think that at least some of you are familiar with them. Those are Alejandro Vigo and Jose Torralba. Jennifer at least knows them. As my title indicates, however, the bulk of my discussion will be about St. Thomas. I think it's worthwhile to go into his conception of practical truth in some detail. For me, this is partly because, in my opinion, there has been no little confusion about that, originating, I think, in Cardinal Cajetan's reading of a certain text of the Summa Theologiae. I'm not going to trace that history here, but I do want to look at that text and give another reading of it. And I will draw upon those two authors, Vigo and Torralba, to raise some objections to Thomas's position as I read it. And then after considering how he might respond to those objections, I will conclude with a suggestion as to what he, Thomas, would regard as at stake in this matter. I do also I put a little appendix to the paper on Anscombe's view in relation to St. Thomas, but I'm not going to read that. I don't think there'll be time. So the question around which I want to frame my discussion, this being where the issues seem to come to a head, is very simple. What is the bearer of the feature called practical truth? In other words, what is it that is properly called true with this type of truth? Is it the same sort of thing as that which is called true with non-practical or theoretical truth? I'm going to take it for granted that the proper bearer of theoretical truth is something in the intellect, as St. Thomas would say. It's a judgment, or a predication, an affirmation, or a denial. That's the way he would usually put it. That's definitely the case for him. And the authors with whom I'm concerned all seem to agree that it's the case for Aristotle as well. But what I originally thought Anscombe held, and what Vigo and Torralba definitely do hold, is that the bearer of practical truth is not a thought or a judgment at all. It's a praxis, a human action. For Thomas, by contrast, it too is a judgment, an affirmation or a denial. And this leads to my first text. Commenting on the place where Aristotle speaks of that truth which is practical, Thomas says this, and this is my first text on the handout. The intellect in judging has two acts, namely affirmation by which it assents to the true, and denial by which it dissents from the false. To these two proportionately correspond two things in the appetitive power, namely pursuit by which the appetite tends to the good and adheres to it, and flight by which it withdraws from the bad and dissents from it. And accordingly, intellect and appetite can be conformed insofar as that which the intellect affirms as good, the appetite pursues, and that which the intellect denies to be good, the appetite flees. Hence, since reason and appetite come together in choice, If the choice is to be good, which is required by the nature of moral virtue, reason must be true and appetite must be right in this very way, that the same thing that reason says, that is, affirms, he insists, appetite pursues. But this mind, namely the reason that thus accords with right appetite, and the truth of it is practical. About the bearer of practical truth, this could hardly be clearer. It is not an action. To be sure, it is concerned with action, for action is the object of choice. But the truth bearer is a judgment. And as a matter of fact, a little further on in Book 6, Aristotle himself includes prudence and craft among, quotes, the states in which the soul grasps truth in its affirmations or denials. I think Thomas is looking at that. According to Vigo, however, to say that practical truth is a feature of assertions or judgments is to deprive it of its specificity. He seems simply to take it for granted that practical truth and theoretical truth are to be understood as different species or kinds of truth. In fact, it seems clear that the view of Vigo and Torralba makes them not just distinct kinds, but even distinct senses of the word truth. It is not that there is one generic nature of truth which divides into different kinds. It is that the very nature and definition of truth, in general, differs. It must differ if the nature of the very subject to which truth is properly attributed differs. For the proper this is at least Thomas's view. The proper subject of an attribute pertains to the attribute's own nature and enters into its definition. On the view of Vigo and Torralba, and on Thomas's, theoretical truth is the conformity of a judgment to the thing, the matter that it is about. The matter causes the judgment to be true by its being or not being, as the judgment says that it is or is not. But for Vigo and Torralba, and not Thomas, practical truth is the conformity of an action to something, namely right appetite. Now here, by the way, I would say they are clearly going beyond Anscombe, I think, because at this point they have removed intellect entirely from the picture. You have action and right appetite. There's no conformity of intellect to something and no conformity of something to intellect. So intellect is just, I don't think she does that. I think intellect is somehow in the picture, for Anscombe at least. But anyway, for them, then, there is not a single generic definition of truth that is common to these two truths. In other words, on their view, I think it's clear the term truth is equivocal. They do not seem very concerned to pin down the nature of this equivocity, and neither am I. What I want to present and discuss is only Thomas's own understanding of the nature of the distinction between practical truth and theoretical truth. To begin, I will say some things about his way of distinguishing between practical and theoretical intellect in general. It has been pointed out that Aristotle uses the word practical to qualify the word truth only once, and that is in that Nicomachean Ethics passage. As far as I know, that the text that I quoted a moment ago from Thomas's commentary on that passage is likewise the only place where he qualifies the word truth in this way. And I'm not aware of either thinkers ever qualifying the word truth with the word theoretical or speculative, which is surprising. At least in Thomas, I haven't found any place. What do frequently appear in Aquinas' writings are expressions such as the truth of speculative intellect and the truth of practical intellect. The latter expression, of course, underscores his considering this truth to be a feature of intellect. This, of course, does not immediately imply that in this distinction he is taking the term truth univocally. He would not be taking it univocally if, in fact, he were taking speculative intellect and practical intellect themselves to be distinct powers. In that case, truth would have two different proper subjects, just as it does for Vigo and Torralba. But Thomas is as clear as can be that human beings have only one power to which truth belongs. Only one intellect that is the subject of any truth. In the Summa, he says this, and this is text number 2 on the handout. I'll just read it. It's long, but I'll read it. I think it's important. Practical and speculative intellect are not diverse powers. The reason for this is that, as was said before, that which is incidental to the nature of the object that some power regards does not diversify the power. Whereas it is incidental to a colored thing that it be a man or large or small, and so all things of this sort are apprehended by the same power of sight. But it is incidental to something apprehended by intellect that it be ordered to operation or not be so ordered. And it is in this way that speculative and practical intellect differ. The speculative intellect is that which does not order what it apprehends to operation, but to the sole consideration of truth. But that intellect is called practical, which orders what it apprehends to operation. And this is what the philosopher says in De Anima, Book 3, that the speculative differs from the practical by its end. So it is by an end that each of them is named, this one speculative and that one practical, which is to say, operative. Now, on first reading, this position may seem hard to square with two things that Thomas says elsewhere in the Summa. The first, which is, he says at the very start of the Summa's treatise on truth, is that the word true names that to which intellect tends and in which its operation terminates. In other words, truth means the intellect's end. The other thing which he says in several places, including the very article from which the above quotation was taken, the one I just read, is that truth is the intellect's object. And so if powers are distinguished by their objects, specified by their objects, and truth is the object of the intellect, and it is also intellect's end, and speculative and practical intellect are distinguished by their ends, are they not distinct powers after all? And will not truth itself then have distinct senses? But really this problem is not very difficult to resolve. For Thomas is clear that it is not just any end to which something may be ordered that can diversify or specify the thing. It must be the thing's immediate or proper end. In the case of a power, it is the end that constitutes the terminus or the completion of the power's own operation. That is, the operation which is elicited from it, in his language, or which proceeds from it immediately. The agent using this power may be seeking this end only as a means to some further end, one whose attainment is proper to some other power. But that further end is incidental to the nature of the power whose end is being sought as a means to it. So Thomas is saying that speculative and practical intellect are one power because their proper or immediate ends are of the same nature. And that nature is called truth. What further end, if any, is being sought through the use of the one intellectual power and of its object is incidental. It does not make for a diverse power. The proper end and object of all intellect as such is truth. Speculative intellect means intellect used in the pursuit of this end for its own sake. Practical intellect means intellect used in the pursuit of this end for the sake of a further end, one to be attained in or through the operation of some other power or powers. However, even if Thomas is, after all, taking the term truth univocally as applied to the truths achieved by speculative and practical intellect, we can still ask whether he sees them as distinct kinds of truth. Is truth univocal as color is univocal, a generic nature that is divided into various species, each with a proper nature of its own? Do the truths of speculative and practical intellect differ as species of a genus? There's at least one place where Thomas seems to say that they do. This text would at least bring him closer to Vigo and Toralba. It is the one to which Cajetan's reading has given rise to what, in my opinion, is no little confusion, at least within the Thomistic tradition, which in a sense is a branch, I think we can say, in some sense, of the Aristotelian tradition. I say that in case anybody is wondering what this paper has to do with the topic of the conference, the Aristotelian tradition. I think we are somehow in the Aristotelian tradition here. So that text, which is again from the Summa Theologiae, belongs to a discussion of the virtue of prudence. The issue is whether prudence is a virtue, or more fully, whether it's a virtue that's necessary for living well, which is a rather loaded expression, as we've heard earlier today from Donenjay. An objection says that it is not, because an intellectual virtue is one that always says the true and never says the false. That's a thesis which Thomas takes again from Book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics. In other words, intellectual virtue, as he understands it, is infallible. But prudence is about agenda, things to be done, which are variable and contingent, and it is just not human, the objection says, to be infallible about such things. And so prudence is not a full-fledged virtue, intellectual virtue. Thomas's reply is as follows, and this is the third text. The true of the practical intellect is taken in a different way from the true of speculative intellect, as it says in Ethics, Book 6. For the true of speculative intellect is taken by conformity of the intellect to the thing, the res. We could translate that to matter, I think, and that would be okay. And because the intellect cannot be conformed infallibly to things in contingent matters, but only in necessary ones, therefore no speculative habit about contingent matters is an intellectual virtue. You can have opinion about them, but that's not an intellectual virtue. There's only virtue about necessary ones. But the true of practical intellect is taken by conformity to right appetite, which conformity has no place in necessary matters, which do not come about by the human will, but only in contingent matters that can be brought about by us, whether they be interior doable things or exterior makeable things. And hence, virtue of the practical intellect is posited regarding contingent things alone. Regarding makeable things, craft, virtue of ars, and regarding doable things, prudence, prudentia. Now, on first reading, this passage may indeed sound as though there are two kinds of truth. One would be the ordinary conformity of the intellect to the thing understood, but there would also be another kind. For there, it seems to say, is another measure to which the intellect is to be conformed. And that is proper to practical intellect. It is not the thing that the understanding is about that would be the doable or the makeable thing, but rather right appetite. That is, moral virtue, or if you prefer, a good will. Sometimes he puts it that way, a good will. That would be the proper measure in practical matters according to which practical intellect is right. And so it seems truth can be taken as a generic term, meaning, let's say, the rectitude of the intellect. One kind is that which is measured by the thing, and the other is that which is measured by right appetite. Now, it's quite true that for Thomas, practical intellect is measured by right appetite. He says so explicitly in the commentary on the Ethics, and he says the same in several other places. The idea is very simple, and we've heard it here at various moments. Prudential reasoning is reasoning about what is for an end. Its results would not be right or true unless the end were the due end, the right end. And what the end is depends upon the appetite or the will of the reasoner. So prudential reasoning is reasoning in accordance with right appetite, appetite of the due end, as opposed to some undue or bad end, wrong end. Prudence presupposes such appetite, which is to say presupposes moral virtue and reasons in harmony with it. However, this cannot be what the passage which I just quoted is speaking of. That's not what he means here. I say this, first of all, in view of the inclusion in the final sentence of the virtue of craft. Thomas holds that one difference between craft and prudence is that craft does not presuppose right appetite. A capacity to hit truth unerringly about makeable things does not require moral virtue or goodwill. In matters of craft, one may be able to hit the truth infallibly, even if, having a bad will, one is not disposed to use or comply with that truth. It is only in matters of action or conduct that the lack of disposition to comply with the truth precludes even the capacity to hit the truth infallibly. So what is the passage talking about when it speaks of the conformity of intellect to right appetite? Well, I would say it's speaking about a conformity that goes in the opposite direction, with intellect as the measure of appetite. In fact, it's the conformity that we saw Thomas assert in the passage from the Ethics Commentary, according to which appetite pursues just what reason affirms. The body of the article from which our present passage is taken, the one I just quoted last, in fact, is all about how prudence is necessary in order to rectify the appetite. Not the appetite of the end, the rectitude of which is from moral virtue, but the appetite of what is for the end, that is, choice. Prudence is necessary for good choice, he says, and therefore, and that's the point of the article, it is necessary for living well. Now, there's another text, the next text that I'll present in a moment, which I think offers very clear confirmation of this interpretation. In fact, up to this point of everything I've said so far, so does Cajetan's interpretation of the article. He takes the conformity to right appetite, he also takes it this way, the conformity to right appetite that the passage speaks of, to be practical intellects measuring the rectitude of the appetite regarding what is for the due end. Not the end itself, but what is for the due end. But Cajetan nevertheless thinks that the article is giving us two kinds of truth, and he says this explicitly. One is the ordinary conformity of intellect to the thing. This truth, he says, resides in an act of cognition, connoscere, an ordinary cognitive act. It is not found solely in speculative intellect. He insists that practical intellect also has acts of cognition. It does perform acts of cognition. But only speculative intellect can be so disposed that its acts of cognition hit truth in an infallible way. And that only in necessary matters. The other kind of truth, according to Cajetan, is proper to practical intellect. It is not an act of cognition, but an act of direction. Dirigere is his word. It is precisely the intellect's giving good direction to the appetite, measuring and rectifying the appetite. Truth, after all, means the good of the intellect. And the good of practical intellect is to direct action well. The proper function of practical intellect for Cajetan is not to determine how things are, it is to guide choices. The truth of direction, of dirigere, is the truth of practical intellect precisely as practical. And Cajetan thinks this is how Thomas resolves the question of infallibility. Being about contingent things, prudence cannot be infallible in cognition, but it is infallible in direction. Inevitably, even prudent persons will err about some fact or other, but they still always make good choices, the right choices to make in their situations. That's his reading. Now, one kind of prima facie objection to Cajetan's reading is that it does not fit the ordinary use of the word truth. Usually, whatever truth is ascribed to, it means that what it is ascribed to conforms to a measure, not that it measures something else. Okay? And indeed, I think Thomas always uses the word in that way. He will say justice is a kind of truth, okay? Because it's in conformity with the measure of what's just. Right? He says that's an extended use of the word truth, but it's still at least in accordance with a measure. It doesn't measure something else. And Thomas does say that intellect can measure a thing. He also says that. But in that respect, what has truth is the thing and not the intellect. Nor is that truth in the proper sense for Thomas. The truth of a thing which is according to an intellect that measures it. Only intellect has truth in the proper sense of the word for him. He insists on that. But in any case, there is a text which I think shows quite decisively that Cajetan's reading cannot be right. He's saying that what the truth of practical intellect consists in is its rectifying appetite. But Thomas is really quite clear that this is not what that truth consists in. It is only a result of that truth. The ethics commentary passage was already fairly clear about it. He said, as we heard earlier, reason must be true and appetite must be right in this very way, that the same thing which reason says, that is, affirms, appetite pursues. The choice is good because it is a pursuit of what the true intellect affirms. By virtue of having truth in itself and by supposing the right appetite of the end, the affirmation has the effect of establishing rectitude about what is for the end in the appetite. But this is only an effect of its truth, not what its truth consists in. The decisive text is a very nearby article of the Sohma. This is text number 4, the last text. It's part of a, I won't read that whole text. I'm just going to quote the ones that are in boldface. I'll mention those. It is part of a question on the mean of virtue, another point that's come up this morning. In this article, Thomas asks whether intellectual virtue has a mean, or somehow regards a mean. That is, whether the goodness of its works has a measure that can be either exceeded or fallen short of. And he says it does. For its goodness is its truth. And here he says, the ratio veri, the nature of the true, or the definition of the true, quote, consists in a certain mean by conformity to the thing itself, according as it says of what is, that it is, or of what is not, that it is not. The measure is the thing. And it is a mean, he is saying, because it can be either exceeded by saying of what is not that it is, that's exceeding, going overboard somehow, or fallen short of by saying of what is that it is not. We can quarrel with that as really a mean and exceeding and falling short of, but that's not really the issue here, I think. But what is interesting for us is that quite universal assertion that the nature of the true, the ratio veri, consists in the intellect's conformity to the thing. He neither restricts this formulation to the truth of speculative intellect, nor offers any other kind of truth that would be proper to practical intellect. To be sure, he does make a distinction in this article about the true, depending on whether it is of speculative or practical intellect. The good of speculative intellect, he says, is the true absolutely. Absolute. The true of practical intellectual virtue is the true not absolutely, but, again, according to conformity with right appetite. Nevertheless, he's not at all positing another kind of truth. What he says next, in fact, is that the true of practical intellectual virtue is measured by the thing, and that the mean of such virtue is taken by conformity to the thing, just as in speculative virtue. Very same thing. And that's to be noted. What is taken in this way is the true of practical intellectual virtue. The truth hit by prudence as an intellectual virtue, and this is directed at Cajetan, what I'm saying, as an intellectual virtue, which is to say as infallible, is measured by the thing. It's a cognitive act measured by the thing. Then finally, Thomas explains what conformity with right appetite means in this context. And it is just what I said a moment ago. It is not prudence as being measured by right appetite of the end. Rather, he says that the truth of practical intellectual virtue is also itself a measure of right appetite. And in this respect, its truth is not measured by a mean, rather it is itself a mean, measuring and regulating moral virtue. So prudence certainly does rectify the appetite, there's no question about that. But its doing so is not what its truth consists in. Again, it's only a result. What its truth consists in is what speculative intellect's truth consists in. Just as speculative and practical intellect are one and the same power, so their truth is one and the same good of this power. For Vigo, making practical truth a feature of judgments deprives it of its specificity. For Thomas, that is as it should be. There's no such thing as its specificity. It is not a species of truth at all. It differs from speculative truth not in its own nature, but by an adjoined condition. It's measuring and regulating, and in that sense being in conformity with right appetite. By virtue of this condition, practical truth tends to yield action, the action that the appetite which it regulates pursues, the action that is the object of good choice. This, I believe, is for Thomas what makes practical truth practical. But it is not what makes it truth. So now let me consider a few objections to Thomas's conception of practical truth as I have interpreted it. One objection is already on the table. How, on this account, is prudence an intellectual virtue, a disposition always to say the true and never the false? Unfortunately, and this is what's maddening for me about this text, one that Cajetan reads in a different way, is supposed to respond to that objection about infallibility, but he does not actually say explicitly whether or not or in what way prudence is infallible. He usually is very explicit, in his responses, but here he's not. Nevertheless, in the ethics commentary, it at least comes out that Thomas does regard prudence as somehow infallible. He says, quote, "The intellectual virtues by which we so say the true that falsehood never sneaks into them, whether about necessary things that do not vary or about contingent things, are these habits: science, prudence," and here Thomas says, under which Aristotle, he's commenting on the text of Aristotle, under which he here includes craft, which is also about contingents, and also wisdom and understanding. But how should we understand this? Is Thomas simply denying what the objection said, that our intellect cannot be infallible about contingent things? I don't think so. I think he agrees with that. Or more precisely, he agrees that our intellect cannot be infallible about contingent things taken absolutely or without qualification. What I mean is this. There are some necessary things about which the intellect can be so disposed as to say only the true and never the false. But there are no contingent things of this sort. Not even the actions that are in one's power are of this sort. For the features that one ascribes to one's actions are in part a function of their circumstances, and it is impossible to be infallible about the circumstances. Of course, a prudent person will get as close to the truth about the circumstances as he or she can and should, but occasional error is humanly inevitable. And I take it that these, that is, the actions that are in one's power, are what make up the field of the things, the res, that constitute the measure of practical truth. For it is action that is the object of choice, and practical truth's measuring appetite consists in its rectifying choice, giving choice its due object. But even if about the actions in our power we cannot be absolutely infallible, I think Thomas is saying that the prudent person is infallible about them in a certain respect. It's the very respect in which the truth of prudence measures right appetite, namely, as to the action's choiceworthiness. Prudent persons will sometimes choose actions that, for reasons that they are not and could not reasonably be aware of, do not have all the features or results that they expect or desire. Nevertheless, they are actions that the person judges to be then and there fit to choose. And then and there, in that person's circumstances, which include his or her fallibility, they are fit to choose. After all, a person who is truly prudent will be perfectly aware of being fallible and will take that duly into account. Even in retrospect, the person's choice will be seen to have been a good one to make at the time. To make it well was then to be living well for that person. The action chosen was choice-worthy when the choice of it was made for the one who made it. And the person's judgment of it with respect to its choiceworthiness, which is to say, simply its suitability to the due end, its conduciveness to the due end, that judgment was true. Its truth was its conformity to the thing that it was about. It's saying that it's saying the thing to be as it was. And it is only in this respect, I think Thomas means, that practical intellect's work is to be assessed. That it can err about its things in all other respects is no detriment to its being virtuous. Its proper good is truth, not absolutely, but with respect to conformity with right appetite. So, Cajetan is certainly right to say that prudence will infallibly succeed in rectifying the appetite. But how does it do that? It does it by judging the appetite's object as such infallibly. And its truth is in that judgment, in the cognitive act. Its truth is what measures the appetite. And again, we should not overlook craft. Craft does not succeed per se in rectifying the appetite. Its possessor may not use it. But its truth is still a measure of appetite, a criterion to discern in the craft's sphere between right and wrong choices. The product may turn out wrong for reasons outside of one's control, but if one follows the craft, then one's choices about the making of it, the making of the product, as such, will be right. So let me now raise some other objections, these on behalf of Vigo and Torralba's view. One objection rests on Aristotle's making the conclusion of a practical syllogism an action. We talked a little bit about that. What is more likely to be the bearer of practical truth than the conclusion of a practical syllogism? Now, Aquinas is perfectly happy to say that the conclusion of the practical syllogism is an action. He says that in several places. In other places, he says the conclusion is what is for the end, or the useful. And these could be simply other ways of saying that it is an action. But what he does not say, and would not say, is that the conclusion is an action rather than anything else. In fact, sometimes he says the conclusion is a choice. In two places, he says that it is a judgment and a choice. And in one place, he accepts all three. He says, this is a quote, "One who deliberates about matters of action uses a sort of syllogism, whose conclusion is a judgment, or a choice, or an action." So he's pretty loose about it. In this, I would say that he thinks he is at least following Aristotle. Right there where Aristotle says that the conclusion is an action in the De Motu Animalium. For first of all, what Aristotle says is that one immediately acts if one is not thwarted or forced. That is, the choice can fail to be carried out. I defer to the Aristotelians here on this, of course, but to me at least, Aristotle does not seem to mean that in such a case there is no conclusion. Right? So we would have to fall back on the choice as the conclusion. But then just a few lines later, what Aristotle gives as an example of the conclusion is this: I have to make a cloak. That's an affirmation, a judgment. And I would say, how can there not be such a judgment? It may not have the I in it. I'm not worried about the I. Right? But there has to be a judgment. The action that is the normal final conclusion of a practical syllogism is the object of the agent's choice. How could it be if the agent did not preconceive the action and judge it suited to the end? Somehow. How else could it be the object of his choice? It seems to me that Thomas would even countenance a sense in which the judgment itself is, or at least contains, the action. The action is in it, not in his language, not as executed, but, quote, as apprehended and ordained by reason. The action successfully executed, if it is successfully executed, is the same as the action apprehended and ordained. Even though, as Aristotle might say, their being is not the same. But truth, in any case, pertains to the apprehension and the ordination. What pertains to the choice and the action as executed is not truth, but goodness. The choice being good because the action chosen is good. How can the conclusion to which truth pertains not be a cognitive act if the principles from which it derives, the premises of the syllogism, are cognitive acts upon whose truth that of the conclusion depends? If the conclusion is not cognitive too, then it cannot be true in the same sense. And so how can its truth derive from that of the premises? After all, is not the function of syllogisms to preserve truth? How is it preserved if it has become a different sort of thing altogether? That, however, leads to another objection. For it is sometimes said or suggested that not all sound syllogisms are truth-preserving. Only sound theoretical syllogisms are. Sound practical syllogisms are rather good-preserving. What would Thomas say about that? I think he would say, first of all, that even if it has some validity, it is badly put. The proper object of intellect and reason is not the good, but the true. The good is the object of the will, and it is chiefly something outside the soul, as he says. Secondarily, it is a feature of the will itself, insofar as what is willed is a good that is fit to will, which is to say, a true good, which here, for Thomas, means not only a genuine good, but also one that is truly apprehended as good. For the will takes its object from reason's apprehension. The will's goodness is nothing other than its rectitude as measured by reason. Now, obviously, the practical syllogism, which is in the soul, does not per se preserve the goodness of things outside the soul. In a way, it does preserve the goodness of the will, but in this respect, I think it would be a little better to say that it is rectitude preserving. But the crucial question is, how does it preserve the will's rectitude, if not by preserving reason's truth about the good? Thomas insists that the good itself is matter for truth, or in his language, falls under the ratio veri. There's truth about the good. And it is precisely through relating to reason as a matter for truth that the good relates to the will as a matter for desire. That is, as falling under the very ratio boni. This is why the will's desire is fit to be measured and rectified by reason. The practical syllogism preserves good only insofar as it preserves truth about the practical good. This is a quote: "The object of the practical intellect is the good that can be ordained to operation under the ratio veri," the good as a sort of truth, or truth about the good. A sound practical syllogism applies the truth of the understanding of the due end to the judgment of the things that are for the end, ultimately to what can be done here and now. But this leads to one last objection, which may be the strongest one on behalf of Vigo and Torralba, which rests on two things that Thomas himself says. One thing is that speculative intellect's knowledge is received from the things understood by it, but practical intellect causes the things. The other is that the truth of the intellect's judgment is measured by things insofar as it is caused by things. So if practical intellect causes the things judged, how can those very things cause it? And if they cannot, why should they measure it? If anything, should it not measure them? Well, again, I think Thomas's reply would be quite simple. Although practical intellect's understanding causes the things understood, what it causes about them is other than what it understands about them. What it causes about them is their existence. It is a principle of bringing them into being. But what it understands about them is not that they exist or have been brought into being. It is that they are good, which is to say, desirable. As Aristotle says in the 9th book of the Metaphysics, even though a non-existent thing cannot be moved, it can be and can be understood to be intelligible and desirable. For that, it only needs to exist potentially. And that is how it exists insofar as it is the object of a thought that causes it to exist actually. Assuming that the faculty of desire is disposed to follow reason, reason's judgment that a thing is desirable elicits desire for it. The desire for it just is a tendency toward its actual existence. And if it is an action in the desirer's power, with nothing impeding, its existence will follow. In other words, practical understanding, too, is caused by the things understood. Only it is caused by them not insofar as they actually exist, but insofar as they exist potentially in the power of their cause, which is the will of the one understanding them. The understanding causes them to exist actually by causing the will actually to will and to enact them. It does so by being a judgment that they are good to enact. But if this judgment is true, it is because they are good to enact. Its truth consists in its conformity to them. As a way of confirming that what I've been saying actually reflects Thomas's view, let me cite a passage from the Sohma's Treatise on Prudence. This is in the second part of the second part. This passage will also help me to explain the importance that I think Thomas would see in the issue of the bearer of practical truth. What is at stake? The passage is from another article on the mean of virtue. Here the question is whether it belongs to prudence to find the mean of the moral virtues. Thomas, of course, says that it does. Following right reason in their proper spheres, and neither exceeding nor falling short of its dictates, which is to say, conforming to it as to a mean, is the end of all the moral virtues. This end is not itself dictated by prudence. The end taken absolutely is not dictated by prudence, but by what Thomas calls natural reason, which is another way for him of saying by synderesis, that habit of first practical principles, which he calls, with other medievals, synderesis. However, determining how and by what means this end is to be attained in action in particular cases is the work of prudence, and only through its work can the virtues actually attain the end. Now, an objection to this that Thomas raises is that it belongs per se to moral virtue, as included in its own definition, to hit the mean. That's just what virtue does. It hits the mean. And so its hitting the mean does not require any other cause, such as prudence. It hits the mean on its own, so to speak. Thomas's reply is the passage that I'm interested in here. He says, just as a natural agent makes a form be in matter, but nevertheless does not give the form the features that belong to it per se, so prudence establishes the mean in passions and actions, but nevertheless does not make seeking the mean be suitable to virtue. In other words, prudence presupposes the tendency of the virtues toward the mean of right reason. It doesn't give that primary tendency. It causes the virtues to follow this or that particular path so as to attain the mean. But how does it cause that? It does so in the way that I just discussed. Not by judging that the virtues are following the path, but by judging that following that path is a suitable way of pursuing the end. And that is nothing other than to judge that the path or the pursuit along it is choice-worthy. But here is why I think Thomas would say that it's important that this is a genuine judgment, a cognitive act, an intellectual affirmation to which truth in the ordinary sense can be ascribed. The judgment that the path is desirable certainly presupposes the inclination of the virtues toward their proper end. But that inclination itself has its root in reason, in synderesis, the habit of the understanding of first practical principles. The end is naturally understood without reasoning to suit human beings as human. Such understanding is exquisitely intellectual for Thomas. The grasp of a primary truth, a universal truth, formulable in a proposition. The primary truths are themselves reflections of the very first uncreated truth, he says. And it's in light of such primary truths that he holds that we proceed to discover and judge other truths, both those of speculative intellect and those of practical intellect. There is a sense in which prudence and he says this, judges in light of moral virtue and of its intention of the due end. He even likens moral virtue to the agent intellect in one text, surprisingly. But ultimately, this light is only, as it were, I would say for Thomas, the window through which the light of synderesis can shine, undimmed by bad inclinations, upon the concrete situation of the agent. Actions are in particulars, and by moral virtue, he says, one tends toward the due particular end. But that is nothing other than one's own instance of the due end grasped universally by synderesis. It is synderesis that first presents the end absolutely or universally or in itself to moral virtue. Synderesis says simply, human beings should follow reason. Moral virtue inclines one to do just that, right here and now. So prudence depends on moral virtue as what inclines us to apply reason to action. But prudence depends also, and more fundamentally, on synderesis itself, by which it is moved, Thomas says, prudence is moved by synderesis in the way the understanding of speculative principles moves science. In the theoretical sphere, science presupposes a vision of the truth of the principles, an intellectual vision, of course, and achieves a vision of what they entail. It sees the truth of the principles preserved in that of the conclusions. In the practical sphere, prudence starts from the vision of the end, as delineated in universal practical principles, and reaches a vision of what the end calls for in the concrete situation. In judging an action conducive to the end, it is seeing the truth about the end ruling the action. And for this reason, Thomas says, prudence itself is more noble than the moral virtues. By moral virtue, we keep in mind, as we face what we are to do, the need to pursue the due end. But it is by synderesis that we see what the end is in itself, and it is by prudence that we see its demands in the situation. So Thomas says, prudence helps the virtues tend to their end. Not just to choose the means, but by choosing them to tend to the end. It helps them do just that. So it's more noble. They depend for their tendency to the end. In a way, they depend on prudence, although primarily on synderesis. In short, what prudence achieves in its proper domain is a genuinely intellectual vision. And that is why I think he would say that's why it's infallible. And Aristotle, too, calls prudence an eye of the soul. Prudent persons see the goodness of what they do. They see it while they're doing it, they see it in doing it, and they do it because of seeing it. The whole point of moral virtue is simply to clear the way for this vision and to comply with it. Its end is to act according to reason. That is living well, for Thomas. So what I think he would see as at stake, and with this I conclude, in this issue is, I would say, the specificity of human agents, and therefore human beings, as intellectual and rational. The properly human appetite, the will, achieves its due perfection through being engaged by the understanding of the truth about the good. And that is why we all need prudence, which I think was just what Dhananjay was saying this morning. It is not enough, Thomas says, to be disposed to follow some other person's prudent counsel. This is the very text that we saw earlier with the issue with Cajetan. Another objection. He says, quote, "When a man does good not by his own reason, but moved by another's counsel, his doing is not yet altogether perfect as regards his reason directing him and his appetite moving him. Hence, even if he does good, he does not simply do well, which is to live well. He is not living by his own best part fully. The human good is to be according to reason, to live in the light of truth. Even those who live by mere imagination and feeling, as Thomas seems to think most people do, may sometimes happen to perform good deeds. But they do not thereby live well, any more than other animals do. The truth of prudence is the ordinary sort. It's truth in the intellect. And for that very reason, prudence is rare." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. It's a great honor to be commenting on this paper and a pleasure to finally meet Father Brock. I think there are three targets of the paper, and it's worthwhile to distinguish them. The first concerns the so-called bearer of truth, and this is identified as the main theme of the paper, in response to claims of some Anscomians that the bearer, shady Anscomians, some Anscomians that the bearer is the action. They're the bad guys. They're out there. I don't know them myself. Brock argues that the bearer is the judgment. The second is the idea that the activities of practical reason and theoretical reason are not univocally the same. One version of this claim is implied by the claim that the truth bearer is the action, because then practical reason's activity is not the activity of apprehending truth, but of bringing it about. Third, and obviously related but nevertheless different, is the question of practical truth and theoretical truth. Are they truths of the same sort? That they're not is implied by the Anscomian account, but that's not the only route that one could get to that claim, so denial of the Anscomian account doesn't necessarily settle the issue. And the question's at least conceptually different from the second question. We could say that the activities of theoretical and practical reason are different without that committing us to any particular claims about what the nature of truth is for the two. Father Brock holds, as I noted, that judgment is the bearer of truth, not action. He holds that the activity of both theoretical and practical reason is the same, with reason being made practical by the presence of desire, of which reason is the measure, and that the truth is the same for practical and theoretical reason. What makes reason practical is not what makes for its truth. Now, I agree with the first claim, but I'll start by discussing an interesting passage of Brock's paper that inclines me to suggest maybe a rapprochement between him and his interlocutors on the subject. And I disagree on the second and third, and I'll discuss a section of the paper that points to why I disagree with those two claims and with how I would adjust the account. It's a rich and learned paper, and in my poverty and ignorance, I don't think I've come to anything like full grips with everything in it, so I apologize for the selectivity of the focus, and in particular, nothing that I have to say is really going to address the exegetical question. Yesterday, I saw a couple people make claims about Thomas Aquinas and then look nervously at Father Brock. I'm just going to sidestep the need for doing that in this comment. I guess just one other thing to add is that throughout my comments, which are fairly brief, there are going to be quite a number of sort of echoes and hints and pre-anticipations, because I wrote this earlier than yesterday, of a number of things that people have said. I don't think that's surprising. Typically, they're going to be said in a much less fine-grained level of resolution than a lot of people have addressed them over the last couple days. So number one, the bearer of truth. I agree that it's not correct to think that the action is the bearer of truth in an unqualified sense. The bearer of truth is the intellect. But perhaps we can offer something to the Enskomians. In his discussion of the practical syllogism and its conclusion, Brock notes that according to Aquinas, the conclusion might be a judgment, choice, or action, and he holds that truth is properly to be found in the judgment. He also holds that, quote, judgment itself is, or at least contains, the action. The action is in it, not as executed, but as apprehended and ordained by reason. The action successfully executed is the same as the action apprehended and ordained, even though, as Aristotle might say, their being is not the same. That's all a quotation from the paper. And I think that seems right, but it also suggests to me the following possibility, that the truth that is present in the judgment is also present in the choice and ultimately in the action as executed, though not as apprehended by reason. And we could go further. Unless the truth is realized in action, then it, the truth, has not come to its full fruition as practical truth. So there's a sense in which the truth in action has a kind of ultimacy, even if not primacy. And some things that I'll say later have a bearing on this as well. Section 2, practical and theoretical reason. Father Brock thinks that the work done by practical and theoretical reason is essentially the same, even if its ultimate ordering is different. The immediate end of reason is always apprehension of truth. And the difference is that practical reason then uses this truth in pursuit of a further end, which involves will and operation. Later in the paper, he fleshes the story out a bit. Actions that do not yet exist, but are possible and are apprehended by reason as choice-worthy, and desirable. They possess these properties. These possibilities possess these properties. Their choice-worthiness is the measure of the truth of the intellect. This brings us to the third issue, the nature of truth, about which more below. But then the intellect, having apprehended the choice-worthiness of these possibilities, brings these possibilities into existence. And so Father Brock writes, quote, although practical intellect's understanding causes the things understood, what it causes about them is other than what it understands about them. What it causes about them is their existence. It is a principle of bringing them into being. But what it understands about them is not that they exist or have been brought into being, it is that they are good, which is to say, desirable. As Aristotle says, even though a non-existent thing cannot be moved, it can certainly be and be understood to be intelligible and desirable. For that it only needs to exist potentially. And that is how it exists insofar as the object of a thought that causes it to exist actually. It's the end of the quotation. The way in which reason causes is by guiding the will, which is an appetite for the goodness just apprehended by the reason. But Brock does not, I think, see any real difference between reason's apprehension of the goodness of possible states of affairs and its recognition of any other property that a state of affairs, actual or possible, might have. And to give a sense of why I disagree with this, I'm going to look at a passage from Anscombe that is quoted in the appendix but wasn't read here, but I think many of you have seen the full paper anyway. But here's the passage, and it's going to be familiar to many of you, even apart from this paper. If a branch falls and breaks a teapot, the falling branch has made it true that the teapot is broken. If a dog bites my hand and it bleeds, the dog has made it true that my hand is bleeding. One might indeed say these things, but they would be trivial and pointless. Practical truth is truth created by action in a sense in which neither branches nor dogs nor children are capable of action. But now suppose that I judge that I should break the branch in order to break the teapot because it contains poison and I need to save a friend from drinking it. And why does the teapot have poison in it? Well, obviously because somewhere there is a man and the man's arms are moving up and down and he is clicking out the sound of God Save the Queen as he poises this teacup. But meanwhile, in the yard next door, my neighbor Smith is looking at a branch of a different tree and thinking that it will fall and break the teapot, which in an unusual coincidence is under his tree. Now Smith and I are making different judgments, though there's overlap. Both of us see the possibility of a non-existent state of affairs coming to exist, a branch falling and breaking a teacup. But I also see the falling of the branch as desirable and as worth bringing about, not for its own sake, of course, but for the sake of saving my friend. What accounts for the difference in what reason apprehends in these two cases? Is it just that there's an extra property, choiceworthiness, associated with the possibility of the branch of my tree falling that's not associated with Smith's, that reason, in my person, picks up on? That doesn't seem right to me. Reason's orderedness to action seems built into its ability to recognize a possibility as an opportunity, mirroring language from Christiana yesterday. You can see this by considering the questions that could lead to the two different judgments. Smith asks, I wonder what will happen to that branch when the wind picks up in a moment, given that it seems weak and badly cracked. But my thought is, oh no, Mary's about to drink the poisoned cup. What should I do? Practical reason is engaged by practical questions. And this, it seems to me, likewise engages reason's capacity to frame possibilities as opportunities that offer some promise of benefit, and hence is to be chosen and to be done. The judgment of reason here is itself directive, and that in turn seems necessary to engage the will, that reason's judgments themselves be directive to the good and not just assessments of the good is, I think, what makes reason practical. Section 3, practical truth. This brings me to the question of practical truth. Father Brock thinks that practical truth is, insofar as it's true, really quite like theoretical truth. It's practical insofar as it regulates appetite, but that is not relevant to what makes it true. Truth is measured by things, and here there's no difference. Thus also the denial of the Anscomian view, in which the acts that are measured by the practical judgment are said to be the primary bearers of truth. Now I agree, as I've said, that truth resides primarily in the intellect, though I think there's also something to be said for the view that there's truth in the action. But I don't think that practical truth is the same as theoretical truth. Brock has argued at greater length against a view similar to mine elsewhere, and what I say here is not a response to the 9 or 12 or 15 arguments that are in that really fantastic article from just a couple years ago. But let me just articulate a couple thoughts. First, we can think about practical truth by thinking about the ways practical judgments can fail. This is a thought that also has been articulated in a couple different ways. The judgment is of the form X is to be done. And this judgment presupposes, even if it doesn't make explicit, that there's some desirability feature possessed by X. X promises some form of benefit, some aspect of human well-being, if it's realized. And that's why X is to be done. Such a judgment, which is directive, can go wrong or fail in two ways. One can fail to realize what one judges one should bring about, and then X simply doesn't happen. Or one can bring about precisely what one wanted to, and yet it doesn't realize the benefit that one was seeking, or it doesn't realize it as fully. One thinks, yes, I'll really be better off if I just elevate myself at the expense of my friend, but whatever other benefits are realized, the friendship is damaged and the good that's anticipated in the action doesn't materialize. Both these ways of going wrong are different from the way a theoretical judgment goes wrong, namely by not saying of what is that it is, or of what is not that it's not. And I agree with Brock that this kind of failure is available with respect to possibility. One can judge that the branch is going to fall, and then it not fall. But failure of practical judgment seems different in ways that should lead us to ask whether there's a difference in what practical truth is. So consider now how practical reason goes right in a judgment that something is to be done. There, reason plays two roles, as we just saw. On the one hand, reason is directing, right in the very judgment, directing that something be brought about, hence the possibility of failure if the state of affairs does not materialize. But reason is also anticipating. The possibility of reason's direction is grounded in the anticipation that the possible state of affairs is an opportunity for good. Suppose then that we've succeeded. Reason successfully directs that X is to be and realizes, in the way directed by practical reason, the good anticipated by practical reason. Then the intellect in its paradigmatic judgment of praxis has been successful. And that seems to me to be the situation that we should identify, in which we should identify the intellect as having judged truly, or at least the paradigmatic situation in which we should identify that. Practical truth is thus not like theoretical truth. It's both directive and anticipatory, and must be successful in these two dimensions to be true in a way that is not the case for theoretical truth. Thank you.
You want to respond to that? Oh, let's see. I'm going to move a little farther away than Well, thank you very much, Professor Tolleson. That was a very serious response. I think I would have to read it, in fact, especially the third one, very subtle. And I don't have much time either, right? But let me just say what I can about it very briefly. The first one, the truth present in the judgment is also present in the action. Yeah, I think that you could say that, yeah. But not in the way in which the cause is present in its effect, let's say. But that doesn't mean that you can attribute the cause to the effect, or predicate the cause of the effect, quite. I'd have to figure out exactly how I'd want to formulate the presence of truth in the action. It's rational action. It's intelligent action. It's action in the light of truth or something. But I'd have to think about that more, exactly how to formulate that. Certainly, the apprehension of the goodness of a thing, the practical apprehension of the goodness of the thing, or if it's being fit to choose, or it's being conducive to the desired end, that's a very different kind of feature that it's apprehending about the thing from its being white or something. It's a very different feature. I think there's a very there's a very good discussion of this, I think, from Thomas's treatment of this and of the truth of what we can call prescriptions, or that something is to be done, the statement that something is to be done or is to be chosen. In a recent book by a professor at the University of St. Thomas in Houston named Stephen Jensen, I think it's a very nice account of that you're seeing the thing as having a certain order. You're attributing a certain order to it. Now, it could be that it's what Thomas would call an order of reason, a being of reason, that order. It's not a real order in the thing. That's a tricky distinction. But that happens in the theoretical sphere all the time, too, right? That what is being asserted, attributed to a thing with theoretical, in a theoretical context, is a being of reason. But it's still, the thing is as the statement says, and so forth, and so the statement is true because of that. Right? So I don't think that's a problem. So I would agree it's a very, very different sort of thing. But I don't think that changes the nature of the truth. And I think maybe I should say this, that I certainly don't mean to say that just any old truth can be either speculative or practical. Right? Practical, because of the constraints on practical truth, that it has only a certain very limited sphere of things that it can be about. Right? Thomas does say I did find at least one place where he says that some truths can be considered either speculatively or practically. Right? He does say that, at least in his early writings. But that's certainly not the case with all the truths. And practical truth, I don't want to say there's no distinction. The practical truth is directive, right, as you say. It is directive, right? And it has that feature, and that's built into the notion of practical truth. I just want to say that's not in technical, that's not a specific difference of the genus truth. It adds on it. It would be more like the difference between spheres and astronomical spheres, right? More of an application to a concrete subject, something like that. It would be more like that, which is not a species of sphere, right? An astronomical sphere. It would be more like that. Maybe I should stop here. I don't know. Do I have more? I don't really have more to say. Okay. I'd have to, but the third, I'm not really answering very well to the third point you made, because I'd have to study that more, I think, before I can give a decent answer. Okay. Try to give a decent answer.
So Aristotle and Thomas say the practical intellect and now I can't think anymore. The practical intellect and the theoretical intellect are not two different powers, but one power.
Right.
Therefore, truth must be univoc. And now, I was wondering, well, first of all, your reaction makes me think maybe I misunderstood the argument, but I was wondering if that's the argument, is that valid? Think of Kant making the same point. Theoretical reason and practical reason are not two different powers, but one and the same power in two different deployments. But the two different deployments lead not to univocal acts, but to different kinds of acts that are distinguished through the different relation in which the cognition stands to its object by being dependent on the reality of the object or by being productive of the reality of the object. Now, you were agreeing with the latter distinction, but then it seemed you wanted to, in order to save the claim that truth must be the same, you gave a certain interpretation of the formula cognition that is the cause of what it understands, namely by saying we need to disambiguate between two different ways of thinking of the object of that knowledge. When we think of it as understanding, as being understood, then we need to think of it as the potential action, and when we think of it as being caused, we think of it as the existing object or action. So it's the same, we can still talk about the same act because it's just a distinction within modality, namely the potential and the actual. So that's the beautiful solution. Now what I'm wondering from the shady side is doesn't it mean that the transition from the potential to the actual, and thus the causality, is one that's not to be understood through the perspective of reason? Now, if you allow me the use of the eye, it means it happens behind the eye's back.
I see.
Because, well, I mean, this is sort of, I think
Yeah.
that's the whole source of the worry. That
Gotcha.
if the causality is one that cannot be understood within the knowledge, then that causality will not be the causality
Good.
of reason, and so it will be the kind of causality of the branch breaking the teapot and thereby having brought it about. And so, I mean, that's, I think, is what drives the shady side to say it's intelligible, unintelligible things. So I just wanted to hear how you react to that problem.
Okay. Good. Thank you very much. Yeah, that helps me to say something that I hadn't said. I hadn't really thought of saying until you. About the first point, I don't think it's essential to the question, to your question, but I wasn't quite saying that it's one power and therefore the truth must be univocal. I was only saying that if it's not one power, it can't be univocal, right? But you can still raise the question, right? And in fact, I think Kadjian would say in some sense it's univocal. There is a very generic notion that we could have, but they're two very different kinds, right? Anyway, so he's almost saying that even though he certainly grants that there's only one power. So, but the causality issue is fundamental. Does it happen behind the will, the intellect's back or the eye's back or something like that? Just sort of the intellect says this happens, this ought to be done, and then somebody does it, right? Somehow, right? I said that, and then somehow it got done, right? That's what you're saying, right? Here I think we'd have to go into how the intellect knows the act of the will for Thomas. And there's a very interesting passage when he's talking about how the soul knows itself, the intellectual soul knows itself and knows its acts, and how it knows the intellect knows its own acts and how it knows the acts of the will. And it says he says it knows the act of the will not only by the presence of the act of the will in the soul, which is sort of, happens to notice that there's willing going on there, and the willing happens to be in accordance with what it said, right? But by knowing itself as the principle of the will's act, right? To say that this is good is to call for the willing of it. And the will does answer the call, and the intellect doesn't make it answer. I mean, you do need it. They are distinct powers, and he thinks that the intellect, the nature of the intellect isn't sufficient to account for the nature of the will. right? It's an additional perfection of the soul, right? But the intellect, in knowing itself and it's knowing its understanding of the good, is knowing itself as a principle of an act of will. So the act of will doesn't just sort of happen, right? Who knows how? Right? It's thinking, it's preconceiving not only the external action, which it says is good, it's also preconceiving the act of the will itself, the desire of the will itself. It's directing toward willing. I don't know if that, I think that sort of answers, I don't know. We can talk. Okay. Okay. Great. Okay.
I want to make 2 points. One is about the Torralba position that you attack. I don't know the Vigo paper, so I'll talk about Torralba. I think he gets Aristotle wrong. I don't know to what extent he gets Anscombe wrong, because Anscombe is a bit ambivalent about what is the bearer of practical truth. Now, I think the only sense in which an action can be called true is the sense in which the action incorporates or manifests the thought which is the source of the action, or the producer of the action. And so the truth of the action is really the truth of the thought, this is the right thing to do. So as long as Torralba doesn't go beyond that, I think one needn't quarrel with him. And the second point I want to make is that for me, the most important part of your paper is the insistence that the idea that the practical intellect causes what it understands, that this proposition has to be understood in such a way that the intellect understands the goodness of what it proposes, but it causes the existence of what it proposes. This distinction is ignored by Anscombe's application of that quotation. She does quote Aquinas in the book Intention, but she ignores that difference. So she wants the practical thought, on the one hand, to be made true by its relating the action to goodness, and it wants the same thought to be made true also by the existence of the action, by the action coming about. I mean, that's roughly what I said yesterday too. But I think this is the main point at which on which you disagree with Anscombe, and I think your interpretation of both Aristotle and Aquinas is right, and we can't have it both ways, as Anscombe wants to. This is
very good. Thank you. Yes. Well, regarding Torralba, I may be exaggerating my reading of Torralba. He seems to approve of Vigo's position, seems to think his agrees with Vigo, but it's Vigo who makes the really strong statements that I'm really attacking. I had the impression that Torralba sort of agrees with that, but if he's only saying to that extent, that's the thing to say. I totally agree with that. And the second point, yes, I think we're absolutely in agreement. I think there's, as I mentioned to you in conversation earlier, there's a very interesting passage in Thomas, another place, the place which Anscombe quotes and is usually quoted where he says that the practical intellect causes what it knows, whereas the speculative intellect is caused by what it knows. That's in very early on in the Prima Secunda, the first part of the second part, where he's talking about practical intellect and speculative intellect as possible candidates for beatitude, right? And there's an argument that practical intellect is the best candidate because it's like God, because it causes what it knows. Right? I won't go into his answer, but there's another place, a very interesting place, in the third part of the Summa, on the sacrament of the Eucharist, where he's discussing the formula of the consecration of the Eucharist and the words, "This is my body," because he thinks that those cause what they express. That formula causes the host to be the body of Christ, right? And it's curious because it's in the indicative, right? and it's just what Anscombe seems to be saying in general about the knowledge by which I cause myself to be doing this is knowledge that I'm doing it somehow, right? And Thomas says, well, that can happen, that this statement, this is my body, can cause what it's an expression of because it's true. Its truth causes that, but it's true with divine truth. Right? So you'd have to say something, for Anscombe's position to be right, we'd have to be God. Almost. Somehow our minds would, right? And it's, there's shady people like that. But I think Thomas is saying that, no, here is where we are just mere human beings, and we can't make things be so just by saying that they are so, right? We can make, somehow our thought can make things happen, but not just by saying that it is so. And in that case, certainly the truth of the proposition is not measured by the thing. God's truth is not measured by, his truth about the world is not measured by the world. It's measured by himself as the cause of the world. Right? So it's quite different. Okay, thank you.
Okay, Sam, you have the comment.
Oh, wow. Okay. So I want to maybe just ask a tiny question and then my real question. The first one is that this is for like a rapprochement between the Anscomians and you maybe. So I take it that you think that decision can be a proper bearer of practical truth, but isn't that an interior act of the will? And so isn't there a sense in which an act can be a bearer of practical truth? Okay. The other thing is that...
Can you say it again? I'm not sure I understand.
Oh, so isn't that an interior act of the will?
But what did your first part of what you said?
Can't a choice, according to you, be a bearer of practical truth?
Oh, okay. No.
Oh, it can't.
No. Choices are good or bad.
But it's a kind of judgment there, right?
Well, but you know, in his you know, I don't use the word decision where Thomas uses the word electio. I use the word choice because he has another word which I would translate decision, which is arbitrium, liberum arbitrium, which is the power of choice, really. So its act is choice. But he says he raises the question whether liberum arbitrium is a cognitive power or an appetitive power. And one objection says it's cognitive because arbitrium is a kind of judgment. And he says, well, the conclusion of deliberation first concludes with the sententia rationis, and then the acceptatio appetitus, the judgment of reason, and then the acceptance of the appetite. That latter is where it really comes to conclusion, the deliberative process with the choice. But the choice is good or bad. It's the sententia which is true or false.